All right, you guys, I'm really excited to be here with you today. I know that we're at the very end here. You guys are here for your CEUs, but I promise you if you stick around and stay present, you're going to get something that's going to be valuable here. Every night when I tuck my daughters into bed, I often ask them a question that I got from a talk that I heard a long time ago. And the question is, what did you do today that's going to matter in 1,000 years? And of course, they sit there and they often don't know what to say, but now they've been coached. And so what we've come to the conclusion with is that there's really nothing we can do today that matters in 1,000 years unless it's going to have an effect in the life of another person. And I just wanted to say first, thank you to you who are here at a conference like this. Everybody who is here is in some line of professional work that is invested in the kinds of things that will matter 1,000 years from now. And so I feel really privileged to be here with you today. The topic today is Shame Resiliency. And how many of you, just by show of hands, are familiar with Brene Brown's work? Right? Of course, this whole center, you probably all read all of her books and probably done a lot of her workshops. So Brene Brown's going to be threaded throughout this presentation, but there's going to be some other content here that will also be helpful. To begin with, we're going to kind of stick with the mindfulness theme here, and I thought it was so beautifully taught today. I'd like you to do your own little miniature mindfulness exercise and pay attention to your bodily sensations, your thoughts, any particular judgments that you have, and what your own experience is when you answer this question inside yourself. Think about what your secret is. What's the one thing in your life that nobody knows or that very few people know? And as you contemplate that, notice what happens inside your body. Maybe the muscles in your face and your neck, your core. What's the feeling in the room right now? How many of you would say there's some type of weight that you're feeling right now as you contemplate your secret? Some type of a burden? You guys are mental health professionals who teach like authenticity here. You guys can raise your hands. It's okay. There's a couple honest people in the back. Great, thank you. We think about our secrets, and most of us feel a certain way. I want you to stick with that feeling for a moment in the context of your own life, because it'll help you connect to the lives of the people that you're serving. Sit with this for just a minute. Notice what your secret feels like, and then compare it to and contrast it to the lyrics of this song. Oh, Chase, we lost it? Okay, we lost it. Have you guys heard of Imagine Dragons and their song Demons? Have you heard that song before? That's your homework for today. Go home and listen to the song Demons by Imagine Dragons in the context of understanding what shame is. And it's a really good way, especially if you find the music video, because it shows different people in different scenarios who are all struggling with particularly different things that most people think they're the only one who feels it, when in reality it's something that happens to a lot of people, millions of people across the world, and yet we all feel like we're totally alone with it. So the topic today is on shame, and I want you to sit in your own for just a few minutes as we talk about this. Shame is an isolating and insulating emotion that every single human being feels. It's something that pulls us away from connection in all forms. It pulls us away from connection to our higher powers, connection especially with other people, and it even pulls us away from being connected to ourselves, heart and mind. And when we're living in and from a place of shame, we end up making decisions in our lives that aren't very effective. And we end up looking crazy to other people. And then we end up in therapy sessions, or our kids end up in therapy sessions with parents who are telling us to fix their kids, and they don't even understand what's actually really driving all of this. So I like Brene Brown's definition of shame: the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something that we've experienced or done or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. And I like Carl Jung's definition even better. Shame is a soul-eating emotion. Simply, shame feeds on itself. Shame survives in the darkest recesses of one's insecure, self-loathing, and self-doubting mind. It becomes this thing that acts as a prison that starts to close in on us, and then it starts to eat us alive. And as we do that, we start to descend deeper and deeper into feelings of hopelessness and helplessness and disconnection. So in my professional world, what I do for a living, I specialize in addictions. I treat mainly sexual addiction and affairs and betrayal trauma. And so often I'll have people come into my office and they'll say, look, I've got this problem. I'm acting out in a certain way, something sexual, I've got a substance addiction, or in your worlds, you're going and, the police are showing up at a domestic violence call and there's some violence, or there's some other type of aggression in schools. And we look at those behaviors as the things that need to stop. And those behaviors are actually what facilitate getting help. And yet those behaviors don't really matter that much to getting better unless we have a focus on the real issue. And the real issue here is understanding how shame works inside of each one of us. And if every one of us understood the nature of shame and how it's working in ourselves and in our clients, we'd be able to duck under all of the stuff where we spend our energy and it doesn't produce many results, and we'd be able to actually get to the heart of the matter, and I believe we'd start to see people's lives changing. So we teach the cycle of shame in my practice, and it starts with a belief system. And I'll give you a personal example of how this works with something that's from my own life here. It starts with the belief that says, I am basically blank. You guys can fill in your own blanks as you think of your own secrets. My personal one is failure. I'm a failure. I'm weak. I'm inadequate. I'm unlovable. I'm unworthy. I'm bad. And these beliefs start to form through all of our different life's experiences. So I remember a particular hard experience, since we've been talking about ACEs today. One of my ACEs was when I was about 17 years old. My friends and I had this kind of habit of, we had snuck a couch up on the school roof. And after our basketball games, we'd go up on the school roof and we'd sit and visit and talk and do what high school kids do up on a school roof. And one particular night, I remember sitting in the game with my teammates, and I was sitting on the bench, and we started talking about what we were going to do. And he said, hey, let's go up on the roof tonight. And for whatever particular reason, I didn't really want to go. I was the youngest one in my group of friends, and I didn't speak up, even though I didn't want to go because I didn't want to be left out. And so after the game, we ended up climbing the school roof up these pillars at Highland High School, and we sat on the roof, had a good time, and then it started to get cold, so we went to climb down. And on the way down, the pillars had gotten icy and frosty, and 3 of my friends descended the pillars, and I was the 4th one, and I was halfway down the pillars, and my 5th friend up on the roof slipped. And he was grasping with his fingertips for about 30 seconds, but he couldn't pull himself up. And eventually I watched him as he came right next to me and fell all the way off the school roof and landed sideways and cracked his head on the cement. My 3 friends who were on the ground got scared, and they ran away. And I climbed down the pole, and I went over and I started to do the first aid on my friend, and I could tell that he was in big trouble. Luckily, one of my friends who'd run away had called the paramedics, and the paramedics showed up. And when they showed up, they told me to run home to my friend's house and tell his parents which hospital he was going to, because they could tell he was in bad shape. So I ran home, I told his parents, and then I walked home to my own house, which happened to be my dad's 40th birthday party that night. And they had a bunch of friends there, and I didn't know who to talk to. And so I slunk down into my basement bedroom, and I pretty much prayed my guts out that night until I fell asleep. And then woke up the next morning to a phone call that my friend had passed away. Now, in that experience, it was a tragedy. It was a bunch of punk kids doing something they probably shouldn't have done. But at the end of the day, what was left for me was a feeling that I was responsible. I had done something by not speaking up when I thought that we shouldn't do it that had led to the death of my friend. And I remember that same day going to my friend's parents' house and barely even be able to lift my eyes and look his parents in the eyes because I had felt so responsible. Now that false belief started to stick with me through the rest of my life. And there was always this feeling that I was wrong, I was bad, I was responsible for this death of my friend, and it started to consume. When that belief starts to set in, we start to see it and feel it as true because we don't have the cognizance or the awareness to question the belief. And so it leads to a second belief, and the second belief says, if people really know me, they won't love me. And this is our biggest fear as human beings because we are wired for connection and attachment. We're built that way. We cannot actually survive without it. And now there's something so wrong with me that if people see it, I'm going to be rejected, isolated, and alone. And so what we do is we scramble and we put on a mask or a set of masks and we perform our way into people's connection thinking that we're going to give them what they need to see in order to be connected. But on the inside, we don't feel like we're worthy of it, and it causes this split to happen. And I personally believe that when you look at things like depression and anxiety, that if you add shame to the mix, it shoots those things through the roof exponentially. Because now there's this split where people are coming to me and saying, Tyler, you're an amazing kid. Like, you're on 3 varsity sports teams, and you serve on your church councils, and you're a genuinely nice person, and what do I hear on the inside? If you only knew. If you only knew. So now I can't even accept a compliment of the good things that I am because I'm believing that I'm something I'm not, and now everything becomes a performance. And there's lots of different masks, you guys. Sometimes I like what Matt Townsend said, that we either we overperform or underperform. That's what our masks look like. So if you're the workaholic at work, I just outed you. You're probably being driven by shame. If you're the shy kid who doesn't want to reach out to anybody and disappears and slinks into the shadows, there's probably something to do with shame that's pulling them into those shadows. Right? And so these masks come up, and now we've set our own prison cell because we want people to connect with us, but we will not let them get close enough to see us. And the only way they can connect to us is to see us and be able to reflect back love and empathy. So in the process of doing that, we're keeping people at arm's length, and it leads to a feeling of isolation, where we start to pull away and go into ourselves. And even if our mask is something social, where we're saying, you know what, I've got a whole bunch of friends, or I'm the funny person in the crowd, I don't actually have deep connections with anybody. Or maybe it's actual shyness or depression, where I go and I pull my head over the covers and say, goodbye, cruel world, I'm not even coming out today. Right? But we find ourselves feeling totally and utterly alone in the lives, and so we live these lives of quiet desperation. And I experienced that for the last 2 years of my high school, where I had a happy face on. I still performed. I got straight A's. I had lots of friends. I did well in my sports and other curricular activities. And almost every day of my senior year, I experienced feelings of being suicidal. To the point that towards the end of my senior year, I found myself standing at the edge of an overpass, clinging to the guardrail, waiting for a truck to come by. And I believe in God, and I believe God saved me because he had someone pull up behind me and solicit sex to me, and somehow that snapped me out of things. And I went home that night, and the next morning I woke up and I started a fight with my brother, which I never did, and my mom said, what the heck is going on with you, Tyler? And she dragged me in, and I got mental health counseling, I got medications, and I started to get some help for my mental problems. Right? So thank you to God for the way he answers prayers. Right? So that isolation then feeds our acting out. And we start to find ways to try to cope with our lives, to try to cope with pain, without needing anybody else. So I even heard it at my table here today, like right at lunchtime, there was a complaint going on that there wasn't enough caffeine at the tables there. All the caffeinated beverages were gone, right? I'm in some type of pain, and I know that every time I'm in pain, I can go and get that Diet Coke and it's going to feel better. Or if I need to keep things a little bit more secret, then I can go find some pornography and feel better. Or I'll go binge watch, what was that, like Small Boat, or what was it, Narrow Boat? Since I live in everyone's trauma all day, I'll just go disappear into some other guy's life and imagine that I'm there, right? And I can do that in a very self-serving way where my brain chemistry kicks off and says, thank you, that feels better. I don't have to worry about this stuff for a minute. I don't have to deal with the pains of my life right now. And it works to the point that our brain says, well, geez, if this fixes like boredom, it might fix anxiety, and it might fix being rejected, and it might fix depression, and it might fix physical illness. And pretty soon that's how an addiction starts to form, because now we've got this self-serving way that we can go to consistently and get what we want from it, and it pays off every time. Except that over time, we develop what we call a tolerance, then we need something new, something more, and eventually we find ourselves completely stuck in the habits of just trying to survive. And then we wake up in the morning and we have our coffee to get going in the morning, and then we run all day long trying to avoid all of our problems, most of us trying to save everyone else by avoiding our problems. And then we can't go to sleep at night, so we take our sleeping medication to go to sleep at night, and then we have to get our coffee in the morning, and pretty soon we're in this like revolving door situation, all running from the pain that we feel because we don't know how to reach out and let people see us. Our behaviors lead us often to guilt at first. We're like, I probably shouldn't be drinking so much Coke. In fact, I'll start on Monday. I won't drink Coke starting on Monday. Eventually, though, we get numb, and we start to sort of lose heart. And then pretty soon, even the things that we're pursuing for coping don't actually feel good, and sometimes we actually despise the things that we use to cope, and yet we still find ourselves going back to it over and over and over again, right? And that guilt turns into toxic shame. And what toxic shame is the difference between guilt and shame is saying guilt says, you know what, I make some mistakes. Sometimes I do things that are maybe outside my value system. I need to shift a few things in my life. And toxic shame says, no. What you just did is proof. You just proved yourself right. And because you just proved yourself right, now you're going to start right at the top of the cycle again. And it becomes this never-ending spiral that slowly leads us down. Thanks, Chase. It becomes a spiral that slowly leads us down, and eventually we find ourselves in a dark place, looking up out of a deep hole going, how did I get here? Right? How did a teenage boy who was having fun with his friends end up suicidal at an overpass? And it was that small spiral that started with the belief system that said, you're not enough. It's your fault. So how does it come to be? I believe that understanding how it comes to be here is pivotal to what we do in our work here, because it'll teach you to see people in such a different light. I view shame as the equivalent of emotional cancer. The seeds get planted, and they get planted in little pivotal moments, and then it starts to grow and build off of itself until eventually it feels like it's consumed my life, and now I have an identity. And it starts with what we call wounds in my treatment. There are wounds that we incur as we go through life. We live in this kind of like broken world where we're all human beings and we all make mistakes. And sometimes we inflict our own wounds. A lot of times we have people inflict wounds upon us. And it's in those wounding moments where things start to shift. And they can either shift into resilience or they shift into shame. I want you guys to meet my buddy here. This is my friend a picture of him when he was about 7, 8 years old. Fun-loving kid, lived in Georgia. Younger brother to several older siblings. He kind of spent most of his days at school. He got along really well with other kids. He'd come home from school, he'd enjoy the love of his siblings and his family, and then he'd go out and play in the backwoods in his house, and just kind of live kind of the American dream. But about the age of 7 or 8, there started to be some conflicts at home. And there was some marital discord. And that stress at home started to spill over into the family, and there started to be some neglect, and there started to be some physical abuse. And eventually there was a divorce, and that divorce took a father out of his home and moved him all the way across the country to New Mexico. And that happens, right? That's life. But what was going on in the mind of that 7 or 8-year-old little boy? He had a 7 or 8-year-old little boy's brain that couldn't understand why all of a sudden life had gotten chaotic, and why all of a sudden his dad was gone, and he was left wondering why his dad had left him and why he wasn't important enough for his dad to stick around. And in that wounding moment, in that wounding process, there begins to be a belief that says, I'm bad. I'm unlovable. Nobody wants me. And now this wounded little boy picks up with a new stepfather quickly that he's unable to connect to, who continues in some ways the cycle of abuse. And that little boy ends up becoming someone who leaves the home a little bit early because he can't stand being at home anymore, and ends up with multiple addictions, touching base with the legal system several times, and eventually as a young man calling me in the middle of the night, calling my wife in the middle of the night, suicidal, and saying, I don't know what to do with my life. Those wounds start to form, the belief system starts to set in, and those beliefs are what are the most insidious thing. We call them false agreements. It's like we do a handshake with the devil, and we say, he says, you agree to play small the rest of your life and never show up and just agree that you're not enough, and I'll take care of the rest. And by the way, here's how you're going to cope. Insert your favorite addiction. And we unknowingly, because most of the time it's just happening and it's just the reality, and we don't have the mindfulness to recognize that it's just a message that we don't have to pay attention to, we unknowingly do that handshake and we say yes. And I live my life that way over and over again, and then you find adult people reliving the same kinds of trauma that they lived as a child. We call it reenactments, because they've just agreed subconsciously that that's how life is going to be for them. Of course, that affects our self-image. We continue to set off a certain self-image that then brings back into our life the very thing that we were damaged by, and then the loop continues on. So what you get is a bunch of people who are wounded, who won't let anybody in, and then the way that we live is through these shame screens. And these shame screens, this comes from Brene Brown's materials here. The first shame screen is what she calls moving away. And this is what you probably see in your offices or in the field or wherever you're at. You'll see the shame screens. And what you get is this moving away says someone's going to isolate, pull away, disappear. They're going to shut down. They're going to come into your therapy office, and you're going to basically sit there for an hour in silence waiting for them to talk because they're so pulled away, right? The second screen is moving towards, and this is the pleaser place. You know, you've heard that word that we're not allowed to say anymore called codependence. This is where I'm going to be a pleaser to make sure that everybody sees that I'm okay, and if they're okay, that means I'm going to be okay. And so I'm going to make sure that I look good to everybody else, and I take care of everybody else's needs above myself, right? And then the third one is what Brene Brown calls pushing against or moving against. And this is where you get this kind of belligerent sort of, call it oppositional defiant disorder type, client or person that's going to say, they're the one who wants to give you the double bird when you're trying to reach in and help them. Right? And they live in those places, and what we see and what we do too often is we continue to pathologize them and say, yep, they're oppositionally defiant. Like, let's hurry and slam them to the ground and make sure that they're all taken care of, and let's be rough with them back. Or you know what? I'm going to go in and reach into that person's life, and I'm going to make that kid start to talk. I do that to my kids all the time. Right? Oh man, the presentations earlier today, I just got smacked in the face a couple times. I'm like, oh, Tyler, I do everything that pyramid says not to do. Right? You're like, I got a lot of work to do on myself. And a lot of that's probably driven by my own shame screens. I'm the professional here. I'm supposed to know what to do. I'm supposed to have everything put together. And, I'm supposed to come here and tell you stories about all the ways my kids turned out awesome. Right? The truth is we're just living life the same way as everybody else. And I'm still trying to figure it out on my own, too. Right? So, pause here for just a minute. Think about what you're feeling still right now. What are you feeling? How many people are feeling like this intense amount of joy right now? Right? How many of you maybe still feel some of that kind of weight that you started with your secret? All right. Notice how you feel when I say to just take that secret for a second and hold it for a minute longer. And then that person that Matt Townsend said is sitting to your right, turn to them and tell them what it is. I love that silence. It just sets in. It's like this crushing, right? It just comes in. Everyone's like, time to go. Forget the CUs. I'm out, right? Or how many of you guys, when I said that, already started to think in your mind like, okay, what's a different secret that's not quite as bad? Right? I can share something that's like maybe a 5 on a scale of 10 instead of my 10, right? All right, good. There we go. I knew you guys were human. That's awesome. So that weight that you're feeling, it sets in and it doesn't really want to relinquish itself. It tries to stay with us, right? All right. I didn't know this was a thing, but you guys just got Rickrolled. Right? How many of you guys knew what rickrolling was? Man, it's more prevalent down in Davis County than Logan, I guess. There's a purpose to that. And it goes along with this next quote. Is that you're sitting in your pain right now, you're sitting here in your secrets, and it's hard to let go of it, it's hard to relinquish it. And what we're in the process of doing and what our jobs are is to interrupt our destructive habits and awaken our heart. That's the work of a lifetime. Every one of us gets to live that process ourselves, and we get to be the help to somebody else in that process. And so when you get rickrolled, at least you laugh for a second, right? Exit the heaviness. So we're going to transition a little bit. We're going to climb out of the heaviness for a second, and we're going to get into kind of hopefully some practical tools and skills and principles that you can use in your own lives and also use in the lives of the people that you're trying to help. And some of these principles are basic, but for some reason we have a hard time putting them into practice. So we're going to talk about 3 C's to shame resiliency. We're going to talk about context, courage, and compassion. And I'll outline a couple of skills through each one of these sort of core principles that you can put into practice and immediately start to work on becoming resilient to the process of shame. And I want everyone to think about shame in terms of we're not actually going to get rid of it out of our lives. It's part of our human condition. It's not going away. So we're never going to kill it, but what we can do is we can learn to become resilient to it. So first is context. When we find ourselves in a dark moment, when you find yourself down in your basement, not being willing to reach out to your parents because you don't want to ruin your dad's 40th birthday, it looks pretty dark. And whatever light that's there doesn't seem to provide enough light, and it seems to be fading, and it feels like with shame everything starts to close in around us. And one of the ways that we become resilient to shame is we try to add context to what we're going through. And when we add context, we start to pull out and we start to see that what we're in this moment right now happens to simply be a moment amongst a whole bunch of other moments. And when you start to see that it's just amongst all those other moments, it starts to look a little bit smaller and feel a little bit different, and it starts to take on a different viewpoint that allows me not to stay stuck in that piece of isolation. And as you continue to pull outward and see the context, one of the first things that you want to do, and this is one of the skills you can do, is whatever it is that's causing the shame is to go and check the facts. So in my world, somehow I end up week after week with somebody coming into my office saying, "Hey, Tyler, I've got a sexual addiction. And man, I don't know who else to tell. I think I'm the only one." And they're sitting there with their hands in their face thinking they're so terrible and they're the scum of the earth. Right? One of the first places that we go is we add some context to it and we help them understand that the pornography industry is a $100 billion a year industry. My client has never even spent money on it, so he's definitely not alone. Right? And when they understand that they're not alone, it gives them permission to start to come out of their shell, and they start to say, wow, like this is a problem that lots of people might be struggling with. I'm not alone here. And if I understand the facts, and if I gain some of the statistics, and I look at things as they are, without all the judgment laid over the top, it begins to take on a different light. That leads to then the second skill here, is that when I'm trying to climb out of the pit that I'm in, and I'm starting to add context, and I'm starting to see moments, what I start to get is this bigger, broader picture that starts to happen, and I can start to find gratitude. And in almost any picture that we find ourselves in, there's still a sliver of light somewhere. Often that sliver of light is going to be the transformational thing that happens that leads us into our greater purpose and passion. And then you stack a whole bunch of moments together and you realize that things are actually not as they seem. And that it becomes something actually magnificent and beautiful. This image was taken by my friend Chase. We have a habit of going to see the sunrise together sometimes. And on this particular sunrise, this is at Dead Horse Point, down in Moab. It was at a time in Chase's life where he had gone through the depths of worthlessness and not being enough and wondering who he was. He'd gone through the depths of every addiction you can think of and some experience with law enforcement. He'd gone through the depths of a broken marriage, and he was at this point in his life that we were sitting here watching the sunrise together, and it was starting to dawn on him that he was ready to make some changes in his life and that he was going to lose a marriage and that he was ready to do those things because he knew what he needed to do to get his life back and to get better. And so we enjoyed a beautiful sunrise together as we discussed his life and where he was going to continue to take his life. Second, courage. Everyone who's read Brene Brown knows her definition of courage, right? Her definition of courage is to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. And then she talks in depth about this concept of vulnerability. If we want to become resilient to shame, we have to get comfortable with our own stories to the point that we're able to share them. Because it's in sharing them that they lose their sting. So vulnerability is not good or bad, it's just necessary if you want connection. The challenge is, who do we become vulnerable to? Because we live in a world where the vulnerability in the wrong place leads to more pain and suffering and trauma. And so a part of what we teach in my practice is that you want to build the right kind of a team. Every person needs a team. And we teach 4 pieces of what makes a good team member. And these are the kinds of things that we should be developing in ourselves to be the kinds of team members to our people, as well as learning to cultivate relationships with others so that we can fall into them when we're in need as well. The first thing that you want in a good team member is that a good team member will love you enough and be interested enough to learn about whatever it is that you're dealing with. They'll be willing to come with you to a conference. They'll listen to a podcast. They'll read a book. They'll do something to speak your language because you matter enough to them so that they can help you. Right. Second, you got to have people in your life who can keep your confidences. These are people who aren't going to go spread it down the hall when you tell them in the office here, and then all of a sudden when you walk in the next day, you've got 3 other people in your office asking you what's going on in your life. They've got to have a good, what Brene Brown calls a good vault. They can hold your information, and it's not going to go anywhere unless you've given them permission to share it somewhere else. Right? Third, you want people who can balance empathy, and we're going to talk about empathy in a second, and still provide you with honest perspective. So they're not going to be yes men. They're not going to just tell you exactly what you want to hear. If I'm over there talking about how I'm so frustrated with my wife and I can't believe she did this and that and the other, a really good team member is not going to be like, yeah, she's dumper. Like, you should have dropped her a long time ago. Right? They're going to be trying to listen and go, wow, it sounds like you're having a rough time with this, and it sounds like she's having a rough time with this, and boy, I wonder what you'd be able to do about that. Or how do I help? Right? And then the fourth part of a good team member is that they're not going to be coercive. They're going to respect your agency and choice. They're going to share their feelings, they're going to provide empathy, and then they're going to say, I understand that your life is your life to live. Go make your choices. How many of you, as you think about your own relationships in your life right now, would have 3 or 4 people that you could put in the inner circle with those 4 criteria? You're lucky if you have a few. And it takes a skill set to learn to cultivate that in an ongoing way, because people move in and out of our lives constantly. And so we have to be in a constant motion of building relationships with people from a wide funnel that narrows down into deeper connected relationships, so that at any given time, I can have a few people there where I might have my wife and my buddy Chase and my brother that I can fall into when things really start to go bad or I start to fall apart. This concept is vitally important to Shame Resiliency, and if you were to sit in on one of my men's groups up in Logan, this is the hardest thing I have to get my men to do, is to reach out to each other, because they feel all those old storylines again, right? All the false agreements. I'm weak if I do that. I should be independent. That's not what a man's supposed to do, right? And yet in reality, the greatest act of courage is to learn how to reach out when you want to go in. To develop who to reach out to instead of taking on the world alone. All right, let's talk a little bit about empathy for just a second. 4 parts of empathy. This is a skill set. Everyone in this room probably sitting here going like, I'm awesome at empathy. Right? I think that about myself all the time, and I promise you, I'll go home tonight, my wife will start telling me about her day, and I'll start responding in a certain way, and what's she going to say? She's like, you don't even listen. Right? I'm like, I'm a therapist, I listen all day. And then she'll say, yeah, for being a therapist, I don't know why anyone ever comes to your office, because you're not listening. Right? And the reason why is because I'm going to jump into wanting to solve her problems, or I'm going to jump into wanting to share my own feelings. Empathy is not about that. Empathy is being able to step in with somebody into the space they're in and offer your presence without needing to do anything else. And so the first way that we do that, and this is how we develop the skill, is we take perspective. And this is really difficult when I've got my daughter throwing a fit when I walk in the door, and I see her like smacking my other daughter. Like, am I going to typically take the time to pause and go like, I wonder what could possibly be going on for Brindley right now? Right? No, the knee-jerk reaction is to get in there and be like, that's the mad thing right there, that, and then the mad eyes. I can get the mad eyes, right? They're like, Dad, don't get mad, you know? It's like, so I snap, get the mad eyes, and then Brindley's in a timeout, right? Meanwhile, I've only seen a little snapshot of what's happened. I don't understand that Brindley's had a hard time at school today, and that maybe she got rejected by her friends today, and she came home and took it out on her little sister. And the only way that I'm actually going to be able to do anything productive with Brindley is if I go into that space while she's in her timeout, and I understand what's actually driving this thing. I've got to go get into her shoes, right? Most of us want to express our feelings first, thinking people want to hear it, and people don't really know what you know until they know how much you care, right? Or my mom's famous line was, seek first to be understood. Wrong. Seek first to understand and then to be understood, right? Second, remove judgment. whatever the perspective is of the person that we're dealing with is not right or wrong. We don't have to get in a power struggle of who's right or wrong or whose perspective is most valid or important. If I'm actually looking to connect through empathy, I remove and suspend that judgment for a moment. So I can temporarily set all of my own preconceived notions aside for a second and approach it with curiosity. That word curiosity becomes a very powerful thing when we're trying to connect to other people. And simply being curious and removing judgment will actually decrease a volatile situation. When you go to therapy school, it's funny that you go to class to learn this. When somebody's really mad at you, you sit down in your chair, you sit up a little bit, you open your posture, and you soften all your muscles. Right? That costs like $4,500 to learn, right? But somehow we can't do that unless we're in touch enough with ourselves to realize, oh no, this is a time to be empathetic. And if I want to decrease a volatile situation, the best way to get to that decreasing that situation is to validate the emotion that's in the room right now. If you validate an emotion, it can't stay heightened. It instantly starts to decrease. Third, and this is the hardest part, I think, is that we have to connect, not to whatever the details are that somebody's saying, but we have to be willing to connect to the emotion that they're expressing. So I can't understand what it's like for a betrayed spouse who comes into my office, because my wife has been faithful to me my whole life, right? But I do understand what it feels like to be betrayed in other ways, and to feel gutted and confused, and to feel self-doubt. All of these things that go on for a spouse who's been betrayed. To feel multiple waves of emotion and not feel like I can be able to grab a hold of how to settle the waters right now because everything feels crazy. I can connect to those pieces in my own life that feel the same way. And when I can do that and I don't make it about me, I now get to be present with the other person. We call it radical genuineness, where I can actually now reflect back, and this is the last part, I get to speak back that emotion. And sometimes that speaking means no words at all. It means presence. We call it holding space. So instead of withdrawing and retreating, or instead of coming through and blowing it all up or trying to fix it, I'm just here. And I'm grateful that you're showing me this. I'm grateful that you're telling me this. I'm connecting to what you're feeling. And when we feel with somebody, we begin to grow the seeds of connection, and connection obliterates shame. How many of you guys are familiar with some of the research on mirror neurons? A little bit? Some cool research that shows that we are actually equipped with something called mirror neurons. They found them in monkeys first, and what they found is that they could, with brain scans and imaging, they could see that a monkey could watch somebody else pick up a piece of food, and in the monkey's brain, the same thing would be happening in the monkey's brain as if he was reaching down to pick up the food. Right? And so then that research kind of expanded into us as human beings, and what the theory is now is that we are all equipped with neurons. We're already built with what we need to provide empathy. And in most cases, what prevents us from being empathetic is our unwillingness to let our own dark places be touched. But we actually feel it. We see it on people's faces all the time. So I'm going to give you guys an interactive experience right now, all right? You guys get to do an activity here. You don't have to, but I'd encourage you to. You always get more out of it when you put more into it, right? So you need to partner up. Find a partner. You don't have to share your secret. Okay. If somebody doesn't have a partner and wants one, I'm sure we could kind of make some connections across the room here. For this exercise, there's going to be a couple of things that we're going to do, all right? So You're gonna assign each other roles, and you'll each get a chance to play both roles. All right. So one person needs to be what we're going to call the feeler. All right. And the other person is going to be the observer. And I'm going to play some music, and while the music's going, there's going to be no noise. You're gonna do this whole exercise without speaking the first part. The feeler gets to pick anything they want in their life to think about. Something funny, something entertaining, something they ate for lunch. Doesn't matter what it is. You're just going to think about a scenario in your life and just think about it. The observer is going to sit uncomfortably watching the feeler. All right? And the observer's job, without words, is to read what the feeler is feeling while the music's playing. And then when I stop the music, the observer gets to tell the feeler what they think they saw. And then the feeler can confirm or deny it. And then we'll switch roles and do it again. Okay? So everyone get your assignments for the first round. All right, everybody got their assignments? We'll start with complete silence, okay? And I'm going to let the music go. I'm going to let the music go just long enough for it to be really uncomfortable. Okay? Okay, so everyone get quiet. Like we're playing a Quakers meeting. Okay. Okay, the observer gets to speak what they saw. Okay, you guys, we're going to switch roles now. We're going to switch roles now. You guys go quiet again. So now if you were the feeler, you're the observer, and if you were the observer, you're now the feeler. Observers, speak what you saw. Okay, you guys. How many of you had the partner who was observing get it right with what you were feeling? I would say from my perspective that looks like more than half, probably a majority, right? How many of you had this weird experience of feeling a ton of vulnerability but also feeling more connected to the stranger you're sitting next to right now? I actually saw some tears being shed. I saw some hugs being spread. I don't know what you guys were feeling, but that's great by me, right? Sometimes you guys, we just need to stop and slow down and actually look right in front of us. All it takes is just being aware of what we see, not in the behaviors people are giving, but what you see when you look into their eyes. So, practice of empathy. That's maybe the biggest skill we could talk about today. There's a couple others here. So you can start to see Chase's transformation. This was him during the dark time of his life. And we're going to talk about one last principle here, and this is compassion. And most of what we're going to talk about with compassion here comes from Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion. And if you're interested in self-compassion, I recommend something like selfcompassion.org. There's all sorts of different meditations you can do. There's an assessment you can take for yourself. And there's a whole bunch of information there. So with self-compassion, how many of you guys are familiar with the study that Duke University did on donuts? Anyone familiar with that? Duke University did a study where they brought some body-conscious, co-ed women into the laboratory, and they had them eat a donut in the name of science really quickly and drink a big glass of water. And of course, the whole purpose was to make them feel sort of like full and disgusted with themselves. And then they'd walk them from where they ate the donut and a glass of water to a new room, and inside the room they'd open the door and there'd be a table full of different kinds of chocolate. And then the women were supposed to perform a taste test on this chocolate and then eat as much as they needed to get an accurate assessment of which chocolate tasted like which things. Right? On the way from one room to the next, half of the group got no message at all. And of course, in our own minds, what are we thinking when we've done that to ourselves? We're thinking, you're disgusting, like, I can't believe you just ate a whole donut like that, like, you're a pig, whatever, right? The other half of the women got a message of self-forgiveness by the lab assistant. The lab assistant would say something like, hey, we realize when you eat a donut that fast, drink a lot of water, you probably feel full and a little disgusted. Don't be, like, everybody indulges once in a while, it's going to be okay. And then they go in and eat the chocolate. Now, what they were measuring wasn't the assessment of the chocolate. What they were measuring was how much was consumed. The women who got a message of self-forgiveness ate about 29 grams of chocolate, which is a fair amount of chocolate, right? The women who got no message of self-forgiveness ate over 70 grams of chocolate. And what they were studying is this phenomenon that science calls the what the hell effect, right? Where it's like, I go and I mess up at something. I think this happened to me on the way down here. Like, I'm trying to not eat, like, white flour and white sugar, and I stopped at Maverick. And I was like, well, that like, what are those tornado things are with the sausage and the, like, syrup on them? I got one of those. I'm like, well, what the hell? I might as well buy a skillet, too, right? So total what the hell effect, right? Where I'm like, oh, I've already messed up. I might as well go big, right? Go big or go home, right? We actually think that we motivate ourselves best by shaming ourselves, when in reality all we're doing is setting up the next form of acting out and letting ourselves down again. And we are much better at change when our change is driven by love and compassion. Love is the greatest motivator in the entire world. And yet most of us can't even look ourselves in the mirror and like what we see. We can love our clients, we can love the people we work with, we can empathize with some of the terrible things that some of our clients do, and yet we go home and we look ourselves in the mirror at night and we go, you're disgusting. Right? So we want to learn how to flip the script, and this is a way to start flipping that script. And it starts with mindfulness, and it was really well taught today. For the case of like our exercise here, I want you to bring back your secret right now and let it just settle in on you again for a second. Think of your secret. And as you start to think of your secret, connect it to the physical sensations that you want in your body. What are the thoughts that go along with those physical sensations? And then see if you can give it a name emotionally. Shame, fear, anxiety, stress, sadness, grief. Whatever that emotion is, pause for a minute and sit with it. Just let it be. And just acknowledge that you're experiencing a moment of suffering. Then we're going to move that moment of suffering and we're going to connect ourselves back to humanity. Whatever you're feeling right now, you're not alone even in this room. You're not alone. Whatever you're feeling has been felt before and is probably being felt by other people even in this room right now. There's millions of people right now in this moment feeling a similar emotion to what you're feeling. What you're experiencing makes you human. That's it. Then the third part, I'm going to add a little bit of cheesiness for you guys, is the self-compassion part. And take your hand and press it right over your heart with enough pressure that you can feel some pressure on your pectoral muscle. And as you take a deep breath in, imagine that you're breathing in the warmth from the palm of your hand. Feel that difference in the palm of your hand versus your chest. And let that warmth go through the palm of your hand into your core. And with every in-breath, let that warmth start to spread. And as that warmth starts to spread, thinking of your situation, you're going to talk to yourself in your own mind like you would your best friend. If your best friend was in the same situation, what would you say? You know what? I love you. You've got this. You've done hard things before. I'm here for you. I'm proud of you. You're capable. You're worthy of love. And then take another big deep breath and just let it go. When I learned this one little skill in my own process, I was probably doing that almost 100 times a day. And luckily, nobody knew what this meant when I'd be sitting there in like a therapy session or something like, yeah, Tyler, you're a work in progress. You don't have to be perfect today. That's all right. You're going to grow the rest of your life. Right? A much different dialogue than we're used to giving ourselves. It's on us to learn how to shift that dialogue and recognize that we've always been believing a lie in the first place. We might as well put in something that's more true. And with the right practice, it becomes a habit, and then we actually start to believe it. One other skill. You know, you guys watch Saturday Night Live, right? I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. Every time I teach affirmations, everyone's like, those don't work, right? That's stupid, that's cheesy. I can't even believe it when I say it. So here's a couple of tips for affirmations. Take whatever that core belief is that you feel when you hit your shame, I am basically blank, and come up with a challenge statement to it. So I'm a failure. Well, my challenge statement is actually no, I'm a work in progress. I'm allowed to fail. I'm a human being. I'm going to get better every day. I have until I die before I stop growing. Right? That's the affirmation. That's the challenge statement. So come up with your challenge statement, and if you don't believe it, put may I in front of it. May I see myself as a work in progress. May I be more patient and kind with myself. May I see that I could potentially be a force for good in the world. Right? I'm holding right here in my pocket here. You guys can't see it, but this is a pinto bean. All right? I like the imagery of a seed because you look at this thing, you guys can't even see it, and you'd step right over it if it was on the floor. But what's its potential? Its potential is actually to grow into a full-fledged plant that produces offspring that could be endless plants, right? Well, I think our potential is a lot that way as human beings. And so one way, if you guys really want to kind of get cheesy with me, and I actually brought some for you, so there's beans right here, and there's beans at the back on the way out. Pick up a bean, And every day, all we need to change the script in ourselves is just like a plant. We need warmth, we need sunlight, we need moisture. So we're going to give it everything except the sunlight. Put that bean in your sock. And every time you feel that bean in your sock, you're at least giving it the moisture and the warmth, right? And every time that bean rolls around on your foot and it makes you uncomfortable and you get a blister at the end of the day, every time you feel that, it's your cue to practice self-compassion. Because you won't do it automatically. And if you don't have a bean, throw your spare change in or something. Okay? Practice affirmations and self-compassion. This is a favorite quote of mine. Hang on the walls of your mind the memory of your successes. Hang these pictures on the walls of your mind and look at them as you travel the roadway of life. So much of our lives are spent living in a place of I'm not that we forget that we are a living miracle. And those people who learn to be wholehearted start to operate from a place of understanding instead of who I'm not, who I am. I'm not a failure. I'm actually a force for good. And all of the hell that I've been through in my life has actually produced in me a desire to make other people's lives better. Right? That's who I am. And when I start to live from that place, just like the way shame drives us down, when you start to live from a place of I am, you start to move up and you start to prove yourself right. And you start to like what you see in the mirror. And you go from a little wounded boy to a damaged kid in college to someone who makes something out of their life. And I just wanted to share this with you as my way of saying thank you. Chase is actually here tonight. Chase is responsible for every one of the pieces of art that you saw in the presentation tonight. And I'm a firm believer that every one of us has a story. And our stories matter. And our stories can be an impact for good in the lives of other people. And when we hide them, we do ourselves and we do everybody else around us a disservice. And so I'd like to just end with a final thought here, and it's a poem called The Man in the Glass. It says, when you get what you want in your struggle for self, and the world makes you king for a day, then go to the mirror and look at yourself and see what that man has to say. For it isn't your mother or father or wife whose judgment upon you must pass. The fellow whose verdict counts most in your life is the one staring back from the glass. He's the fellow to please, never mind all the rest, for he's with you clear to the end. And you've passed your most dangerous, difficult test if the man in the glass is your friend. You can travel this world down the pathway of years, getting pats on the back as you pass, but your final reward will be heartache and tears if you've cheated the man in the glass. You guys, let's stop cheating the man in the glass. Start treating ourselves with compassion and love and unleashing that force that's within every single one of us that makes us great. And I believe that you'll become a force of good in all of the lives of the people that you are surrounded by. And in doing so, you'll give them permission to unleash their good because they realize they no longer have to hide. So again, I'm thankful for letting me come today, and that's all I have. Thank you.